So Julie, we want to start with your maybe journey to date for Style Runner, and how did you get to where you are right now?
When I first had the idea for Style Runner, I didn't actually have a background in e-commerce. So I was in digital marketing, but I essentially had to learn a lot. I went to a lot of digital conferences, online commerce conferences, and learned as much as I could. And of course, we brought people on board in our team who had expertise in different areas. But certainly a bit of jumping in the deep end, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs do, and learning how to swim.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. And out of all the businesses you could have started, what is it about Style Runner and e-commerce? Like, why did you pick that particular niche?
I really chose it because I saw a gap in the market. I've always wanted to start a business, but I didn't want to do something that was incredibly crowded with competition. So the difference here is it is an online store, an e-commerce store, which there are plenty of, but there wasn't one that was doing really well in sportswear, particularly for women's sportswear. So the business model exists, we're not reinventing the wheel, but what we're doing is seeing a place that hasn't been flourishing and trying to do that better in that particular market.
Okay, and what does it take on? We heard this previously from Kate, who's the founder of Drop Dead Gorgeous Daily, and she said that she tried e-commerce and it didn't work. She had an amazing fashion blog, but tried to retail fashion, just didn't work. What is it about Style Runner that has been different to Kate's experience?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of where fashion is already pretty crowded. There's a lot of competition, and customers already have a place which they love. Generally, in each market, the number one and number two in a market will take about 70% of the market share. Right. So we saw a market which was sportswear, where there wasn't a clear leader for women's sportswear in e-commerce, yes. And we wanted to be first to market, which we were in 2012, yes. And we wanted to really, become a dominant player in that market. So really, it was about seeing a gap where we could enter and make a lot of market share very quickly.
Okay, and before you had Style Runner, I know you were an employee, and then you gradually went to becoming an entrepreneur. So can you talk us through that, and maybe any tips for other entrepreneurs who are looking to do the same thing?
Yeah, I started in finance, actually, in institutional finance at ANZ.
Yes.
So I worked in a corporate straight out of university, and I always knew that I wanted to do something a little bit more creative, but I didn't know at that stage that it was really an entrepreneurial drive.
Yes.
At one stage, in my journey, I saw another startup company. It was a subscription video on demand service, which we kind of call a hipster Netflix.
Yes.
And I actually moved to London and worked for this startup for a couple of years, and that's when I really realised I had this startup bug. So hopefully there's something in each entrepreneur's journey where they actually realise that they do have an entrepreneurial drive. I think that's the first part, is recognising that you have entrepreneurial tendencies.
Yes.
And then you need to make sure that you have a proposition which is sustainable. It's easy to launch an idea, but you want to do as much research as you can to ensure the greatest likelihood of success, and this is going to be something that you continue to do. So give yourself the best chance of success with all sorts of research and sort of planning. Lean startup approach. We did that as well. We launched as lean as we could, learned from the data what was working, what was not, before we invested too much. Mm-hmm. That's a really easy way to transition into starting your own business.
Okay, and I'm guessing that you didn't have any sort of tech background, you don't develop apps or anything like that. So how did you tackle an online business without that experience or knowledge?
Again, because there was a gap in the market, I think it was a bit more forgiving for us. So we were really lucky. We were able to learn along the way and get better and iterate and improve our product. In a much more competitive market, it's not to say that you can't launch in a more competitive market, but if you do, you've got to really have a competitive edge from the beginning, be really good at it, and quickly be able to win market share from other players. We entered a market where there was really no other competitor for premium women's activewear. So we launched with a reasonable product. As I said, we launched in a lean way, and then we continued to improve as we saw that data. So it was a bit more forgiving for us, and we simply learnt along the way. But we looked at every single resource we could. We looked at blogs, we looked at thought leaders on Twitter, wherever we could pick up knowledge, we did.
And did you
There's
use
a good quote that I like, which is, when you're not working, you're learning.
Okay, cool. Did you use any freelancers in the early days when you were sort of going that lean startup approach? Were there freelancers to do some of the building of the website?
Yeah, we used a freelance web developer to first build our site, which was pretty lean, as I've said.
Yes.
But what I did do before we hired that person was I spoke to as many different developers as I could to learn what I was going to be building. Yes. From smaller boutique development firms to the larger. So I was speaking to some firms which were building products that started at $200,000 to $300,000. That wasn't our budget at that stage, but I asked all the questions about what does your platform have and why is it worth this much. So I knew the sort of things which would give a great store an edge, and I guess create a product map of what we want to work towards.
And what was the tipping point? So in the early days, I'm guessing you only had a few customers. What was it? Was there something in particular that you did where you went from 100 customers to 10,000 customers, or was it just a slow sort of growth for you?
I think it was an even-ish growth,
Yes.
but it was pretty rapid. So I guess we were growing between 30 and 50% month on month,
Yes.
which is pretty rapid. A lot of that did come from social media. We're very lucky to have a product which lends itself very well to social media. But I believe you can, find your customer on different platforms. So that was a real key for us. Where did our customer, sort of spend their time? And for us, that was on Instagram. And that really helped us continue to, educate new customers about our new store and, have them tell their friends. It's really viral if you come up with great posts and content that is relevant for them.
Yes.
But yeah, we essentially were growing really rapidly from the beginning, and we maintained that level of growth really up until even today.
And so what did you learn on the different social media platforms? Were there any sort of key concepts that you still use today in StyleRunner?
One of the things that works really well for us is social proofing. So showing other customers wearing our product, looking great, that are relatable everyday people just like our other customers. The best place for us to share that is on Instagram. On Facebook, we spent a lot of time building a community there, and then unfortunately they started to change the algorithms and you had to pay to show people your content.
Yes.
So we started to invest less time there. That's not to say you can't get get good traction in Facebook, but it will generally cost you money now to get through to people. Instagram at the moment is still free, and we really use that as our major platform at the moment. And it's about working out which posts are getting the best engagement. One of the things we do, for example, is simply ask people to tag their friend. And just by asking that question, creating a call to action in the description, we see a huge increase in engagement and people actually commenting. So rather than getting 100 comments, we might get 700 comments just by including a call to action. Another thing that we've noticed is quotes work really well for us, and also puppies. So you might not see a correlation between activewear and puppies, but you have to just remember these are everyday humans that are not just coming to Instagram for a particular, product or feed. They're everyday people who enjoy fun things, beautiful things, cute things, inspiring things. And what could you supplement your particular product content with that will engage them? And then when you find out what works, and you'll see that in your likes and your comments, ensure you include that here and there, and that will give them a chance to incorporate that viral factor of tagging in their friends and sharing your post. And that's how a lot of people will find out about you.
Okay, and just before here at Pause Fest, I heard you talk a bit about mobile conversion, and that you still think it's a long way off where it is on, for example, the desktop.
Yeah.
What is it about mobile conversion? Do you think it's the payments, or what is it in particular?
I think, as one of the other panelists said, there's less real estate on the mobile. It's hard to show a lot of about your product at once. So on the desktop, you can have several versions of the product from different angles. On the mobile, you really need to flick through several different photos to see that. You need to scroll to a different part to read a bit about the description. And yeah, it is a little bit more difficult to enter your details if you're checking out as a guest. If you're a member, that's great. You can save your details and check out pretty quickly. But we still see a lot of customers prefer to check out as guests. So on the mobile, that's definitely a lot more time consuming or more finicky to do. But yeah, we still hear that the trend is that mobile conversions are pretty far behind desktop, or they're not quite there. Desktop and tablets. Tablets convert pretty well for us too.
Mm-hmm.
But we're always asking ourselves that question: how can we improve mobile and get it closer?
Okay. And as an entrepreneur, what do you think about risk taking? Like through your journey, have you taken any sort of crazy risks, or what's your views around risk taking in general?
Yeah, I love to take a risk.
Okay.
I think it was a big risk for us to start this business. We started shooting sportswear in a way which really had never been done before, and we wondered whether customers would actually like it or not. This was something that was pretty cut and dry before. It was pretty traditional, and we were suddenly styling it in a really fashion-forward way on models, and would people think it was too sort of shallow or materialistic or superficial? So that was a risk in itself, the entire proposition. but customers really loved it. So my approach is try. Always, don't be afraid to try something. I don't mind failure. I don't mind if something doesn't work. That's data. We learn from that and we work out what does work by trying things. I think that's actually a faster path to a competitive advantage or a difference if you're willing to take risks and try things, because a lot of the established players won't take risks. So that's where you can really gain an edge if you're willing to try something different, work out whether it works or not. As long as it's not too doesn't damage your brand to try something, we're willing to give it a go and learn if we can actually find that little bit of edge by doing something different.
Okay, and I know Style Runner has a very unique customer experience. So what would your recommendation be to entrepreneurs who are trying to create that individual customer experience?
Yeah, I think it's key to everything that we do. We are just thinking about everything from a consumer's perspective. How do I want to have my package delivered? I think we were the first people that ever wrapped sportswear in tissue paper and delivered it in a beautiful branded box. That's generally been an experience that was reserved for luxury fashion. But as a consumer, if that's a more pleasing experience, why not try that? Every time we have an idea, we think about it through a customer's eyes. And again, if you could differentiate yourself from other traditional retailers or other traditional competitors, then I would give it a go.
Okay. So I've been studying recently a lot about human-centered design. So I'm curious to know, in your own startup, do you have sort of customers coming when you're creating new products or new experiences? And do they give you feedback and you change the product based on that?
We have in the past.
Yes.
Now that our team is getting larger, one of the first points is we run it past our own team. We are essentially all consumers as well. We may have a bias, so every now and then we put it out to other parties as well. But if we really question ourselves from a consumer's point of view, if this was someone else's brand, how do I react to this new feature or design? And essentially we are all humans and we'll have a gut reaction to something as well. So the first thing we do is always ask ourselves that, even amongst our team, how do we react to this as a potential consumer?
Okay. And in the early days of your business, I know that you self-funded it. I'm curious to know if you had much to do with VCs, private equity, anything like that. Are there any tips that you can give for other entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time speaking to VCs and PEs. We were approached by our first VCs, and we've been approached by huge multinational brands probably in our first year. So we've kind of been getting to know that world for a very long time, and we entertained some of them because they were fantastic brands to align ourselves with. Some of them went down the road of eventually finding out they wanted a path to purchase, and we weren't ready to sell out completely, so they would end and we'd move on to the next person knocking on our door. And we've really been looking for the right partner. People say that an investment is like a marriage. You're going to spend a lot of time with this person, so you need to make sure it's the right fit culturally. What can often happen is that once they come in, they want to run things a certain way, the way they've done with lots of their other investments, and you want to make sure that you don't lose your magic. So that's something that we're really aware of. We have spent many months talking to all sorts of different VCs, and one of the bits of advice that I've learned along the way is if you think that you'll raise in the future, even if that's 2 years away, you want to start creating a relationship with that person before you need to raise capital. Have them learn about you, learn about your team, learn about your product before you need to raise capital, and allow them to watch your progress. Send them an update every now and then. So I guess kind of create a wish list of the people that you would hope to one day raise capital from, and introduce yourself. They say that's the best way to introduce yourself, rather than knocking on the door and they know nothing about you and you need their money. So we've really been, I guess, nurturing those sorts of relationships with potential VCs for quite a while now, and we certainly will raise capital at some point in the future. Okay,
and we've had some people on the site who have gone out to find these VCs. Some of them have spoken to 3, some of them have spoken to 200. Do you think there's the risk that you speak to too many and you just become you just end up talking to everybody?
I guess I've heard different approaches. One of them I've heard is it's a bit like converting someone on your site. If you think about that funnel, if you speak to 100 people and 30 of those are potential customers, and of those 30, 10 get down to the consideration phase, and maybe 2 of them might be ready to convert. If you think of it like that, it appears that you do need to speak to a large volume of customers or VCs.
Yes.
So the trouble is, if you speak to too many when you need to raise capital, that can be off-putting if for some reason no one else is converting. It kind of comes down to that social proof. Why isn't anyone else biting? So that's where if you take the approach of speaking to them when you don't need to raise capital, you actually can increase your odds of reaching that larger funnel at a stage when you're not actually looking for anything and all you're doing is showing someone a really impressive product and idea and creating a warm relationship.
Okay. And I know Style Runner started out as a family business. Some people think that's a great thing, other people think that's a disaster. What are your thoughts around family business and whether that's a good idea?
I still think it's a fine thing. One of my sisters got married and she's now left the business, but I also have another sister in the business. So I think that it's a really great thing if you're all clear on your expectations, and I think that's the most important part. Make sure you all know what will happen at certain milestones, how will you handle it, how will you handle decisions that you're not able to come to resolution on. And as long as you understand that at the outset, you won't be faced with a nasty surprise along the way. But I think if you're able to start a business with your family and you have those conflict resolution plans at the outset, it's a great thing to be able to spend a lot of time with your family.
Okay. And I saw an interview that you did recently that actually a community, the Entourage, helped you guys in the early days. Do you think that's something that's valuable for entrepreneurs, and how did it kind of shape Style Runner?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of great things that came out of the Entourage. Some of it was meeting people who were, idea openers for us. So I still am in touch with a lot of people from the Entourage. Jack Delosa and Pete are still very, very close to me, and give me advice even though I'm not formally sort of attending anymore. Yes. So sometimes it's about building a network of other great entrepreneurs and thought leaders, which will be perhaps the most valuable thing you take away from it. There were also, I've done a business degree, but there were things that we didn't learn in traditional degrees about setting up a business and sort of accounting constructs at the outset that I found really valuable as well. So even if you feel like you've done some formal education, it was quite surprising that there were some really practical takeaways. But I think one of the big things for me was the networking and meeting some people who are lifelong connections now.
Okay. And Style Runner, correct me if I'm wrong, is international now. Yeah. So what were the pitfalls of trying to go to another country, and what did you learn through that?
We wanted to be international from the beginning. So we recognised that this gap was a global gap. I was living in London at the time I had this idea, and I realised that even in the biggest cities in the world, there was actually a real lack of variety when it came to sportswear. So when we launched, we wanted to appear global, so we launched it with stylerunner.com, and we obviously with social we were able to reach international audiences. So from the very beginning we had orders coming in from overseas, and one of the pitfalls is working out how you will ship to those countries, which are the best courier partners, etc. But we thought we'll work that out along the way. And then we finally had an order from Russia, and we learned that was really difficult to ship to. But we were determined to make that happen. You need to have a partner in Russia, and you can only deliver to a business address and not a personal address. So there are some tricky things to learn along the way. But ultimately, we believe that every problem has a solution, and we were keen to start addressing customers internationally from day one, and we found a way to do that.
So did you end up having to set up a local company in those countries, and did you charge them Australian dollars? How did you deal with that side of it?
At the moment, we're charging in Australian dollars. You're able to browse in different currencies, but when we move over to our ERP system, we will roll out local sites, which will allow people to transact in local currencies. Their local site will come up better in their local search engines, so there'll be some benefits with that. Occasionally, you have customers who incur a customs fee, and as much as we try to make that clear up front, you often have some customers who are a little upset about that, but we just handle that via our customer service and see what we can do for them. So we handle that on a customer by customer basis. But essentially, yeah, we just are very clear that we're an Australian-based company. There will be customs. There are actually fairly high shipping charges too. We don't subsidise it. Because as a startup we're unable to, but 15% of our business now comes from outside of Australia, which is a great amount of business to be getting in addition to Australia had we only focused on that.
And is there any chance that you guys will have your own brand in the future, or is it always to sort of have other brands and promote what they do?
Our focus is really on finding the best emerging brands and established brands. At some stage, if we see that there are gaps that we don't feel are being filled, we may go into those, and they will certainly help our margins. But we really want to make sure that we're doing the best job we can of our online store and focusing on what we know we do really well.
Okay. I had a look at some videos online. It looks like you guys have a pretty crazy team culture. How did you go about building the team, and what tips can you give us there?
I guess observing the team culture is something that you do along the way, and you just ask yourself questions about how you can do it better. So if we see that people are kind of doing really hard work, but they should be getting more recognition than we are, you ask yourself, what could we be doing better? It really just has organically grown and evolved along the way with a little bit of creative thinking. So we do have this peer recognised or peer awarded recognition system, which we came up because we just wanted to celebrate what people were doing. We wanted to have a moment where we say, hey, let's stop, let's share what each of us has achieved this week. So every Friday our peers nominate who they think has lived up to our cultures and our value the most, and then we do an anonymous vote, and someone will win a trophy. It's a flamingo that sits on their desk for the week. And at the end of the month, one of those winners will win a $100 voucher. And at the end of the year, someone wins a $2,500 travel voucher. So that's really just something that we designed along the way to say, hey, we're really kicking goals, we're doing incredible things, let's not forget to stop and celebrate that.
Okay. And throughout your entrepreneur journey, I read that you discovered the law of attraction and positivity. How has that kind of shaped your business career?
Yeah, that's something that I believe in, and I just personally wanted to include in my company culture. I guess that's the beauty of being a boss or a founder, is you get to decide what it feels like to work at your company. So I believe in the power of positivity, and it's just something that I think there's no harm from trying to do. And so I encourage my staff to actually take that path, and if nothing else, it's a better place to work, and it's a nicer place to work amongst your peers. But I've encouraged them to think about whether we are actually seeing some of our positive results as a result of that.
Okay, and have you done any sort of personal development along your entrepreneur journey?
Yeah, as I said before, I think when you're not working, you're learning, and that applies to all sorts of things, whether you're learning about areas of expertise within your business or personal development. It's something that I really strongly believe in, and I'm always, if I'm not working, I'm reading a book or I'm attending a course. We've taken our leaders to courses as well on consciousness and empathy and leading with empathy, and I think that there's always room to expand your mind and learn something new.
Okay, and so speaking of books, is there a particular book that you would recommend for entrepreneurs to read if they're going to do some sort of startup?
Yeah, there's a stack of them. I think one of the ones that had a profound effect on me personally was a book called The E-Myth. And that talks about the need to be, to really wear 3 different hats. And the reason it struck a chord with me is because I realised that I really wasn't wearing one of those, and that was the manager hat. So this book talks about needing to be a technician, so do your task well. You also need to be a manager, and you also need to be the visionary. And I guess the visionary was always there. I saw a gap and I had an idea, and I guess I started doing the role, so I was good at that side of it too. But I realised that I just left people to their own accord to, get the work done, just as I was always a self-starter, and I needed to learn how to be a better manager. And so this book really pointed out your, areas of weakness and what you need to work on, because unless you're doing all 3 of those, your staff won't know how to deliver things to the way that you would like them done, and won't have the support around them to ensure that they're completely engaged and delivering to the highest standard. Okay.
And in your sort of niche, is there a blog that you think is really great amongst the thousands of blogs that are out there?
Addicted to Success is great. I also look to Founder magazine. I think that any place where they're interviewing other founders or entrepreneurs or thought leaders is fantastic. I try to hear from people themselves that are actually in the businesses, trying new things and taking risks. They're probably a couple of my favourites.
Okay, and just to wrap up, online, if our audience want to look at what you do, where can they find you?
They can find us at www.stylerunner.com.
Okay, and on social media?
At Style Runner. particularly on Instagram, but also on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Snapchat.